Somewhere on a remote island, scientists just dug up a human skull the size of a grapefruit, and it changes everything we thought we knew. Flores, a speck of land between Asia and Australia, 3.5 feet tall, the height of a toddler. And this was not a child. This was a fully grown adult. It shared its island with dragons twice its length and elephants the size of a large dog. Here, the rules of size simply broke. Yet these tiny humans carved tools and hunted animals 20 times their size. Islanders still tell stories of small, hairy people who once lived in these very caves. This is Homo Floresiensis, and its story is only beginning. Subscribe to this channel. It means everything to us. Now, let's begin. It is September of 2003. And inside a limestone cave on a small Indonesian island, a team of archaeologists is digging for something that has nothing to do with what they are about to find. Their names are Mike Morwood and Thomas Sutikna. And they are not looking for a new species of human. They are looking for evidence of how early humans crossed the sea to reach Australia. The cave is called Liang Bua, Cool Cave in the local language. For weeks, the dig turns up nothing but ordinary stone tools and animal bone. Then, 6 meters down, almost at bedrock, a digger's trowel scrapes against something that should not be there. A skull, but smaller than any adult skull has any right to be. Here's the deal. For the next 40 minutes, we are going to take apart one of the strangest, most fought-over discoveries in the history of human evolution. Because what came out of that cave floor was not a child. It was a fully grown adult human, barely over a meter tall, and the fight over what that meant would tear the scientific community in half for over a decade. The skeleton was catalogued as LB1, Liang Bua number 1, but almost immediately the team gave it a different name, Flo. Short for Florence and for the island she came from. Every bone in her body told the same impossible story. Adult teeth worn down from decades of chewing. A pelvis shaped for walking upright, just like ours. And a skull that had already fused shut, the way only a fully mature skull does. This was not a child, and it was not a monkey. It was a human being, just one the size of a 3-year-old. For over a century, anthropologists had drawn a simple map of human evolution. One species at a time marching in a straight line toward us. Flo did not fit anywhere on that map. When the discovery was published in October 2004, it made the cover of the journal Nature and headlines around the world. Newspapers reached for the nearest pop culture reference they could find. A few months earlier, The Lord of the Rings had just swept the Oscars. So the world gave Flo a nickname that would stick for the next 20 years. They called her the Hobbit, but a cartoonish nickname could never capture how strange she actually was. So let's actually meet her. Meet Homo Floresiensis, Stand her up next to you and she would barely reach your belt buckle, 3.5 feet tall. About 1 meter and 5 centimeters, weighing perhaps 25 kilograms. Roughly the weight of a large dog, but do not mistake her for a child or for a shrunken version of us. Her body was built entirely differently in ways no human today shares. Start with the skull. Inside it sat a brain of about 400 cubic centimeters, roughly the size of a grapefruit. That is less than 1/3 the volume of your own brain right now inside your head. It is close to the brain size of a chimpanzee, and yet, as we will see, this creature made tools, controlled fire, and organized group hunts. Next, look at the arms. They were long, out of proportion with her legs. A build closer to ancient tree-dwelling ancestors than to modern humans. Now the feet. And this is where it gets strange. Her feet were enormous relative to her legs. Flat and almost human in every other way. Long feet like that would have forced an odd, high-stepping walk. Not the smooth stride you use every single day without thinking about it. Her jaw had no chin. A feature more common in far older, more primitive members of the human family. Every single trait on its own tells a different story. A tiny modern human. A robust ancient ancestor. Something in between. Put them all together and you get something that had never been cataloged before. This was not a diseased individual, and she was not alone. Over the years, the team found the remains of at least a dozen other individuals in the same cave. Men, women. All of them small, all of them built the same strange way. This was not a fluke. It was a population. A breeding, surviving, thriving population. So the question became impossible to avoid. How does an entire population of humans end up this small? And the answer was written into the island itself. To understand flow, you first have to understand where she lived, because Flores was not just an island. It was a trap and a laboratory, running one of evolution's strangest experiments for nearly 1 million years. Flores sits along one of the deepest ocean trenches in the world. A strip of land that, for millions of years, almost never connected to anywhere else. Even at the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age, when land bridges linked most of Southeast Asia together, Flores stayed cut off, surrounded by deep water. Only a handful of animals ever made it across. Carried on floating rafts of storm-torn vegetation, or simply strong enough to swim, and once they arrived, the ordinary rules of biology started to bend. Scientists call it the island rule. On a small island with limited food and no large predators, big animals shrink, generation after generation, and small animals do the opposite. Take the elephants that once reached Flores. Full-sized, several tons each, the same ancestors of elephants everywhere else on Earth, over hundreds of thousands of years on the island. Their descendants shrank down to the size of a large cow. Scientists call this dwarfed lineage Stegodon. Meet Stegodon Floresiensis insularis. A miniature elephant that went through this shrinking process not once but twice, across two separate waves of ancestors reaching the island. An entire species of dwarf elephant standing waist-high, wandering the very same jungle flow called home. Meanwhile, in the other direction, the rats on Flores grew to the size of a small dog. With none of the usual predators keeping them in check, there was simply nothing stopping them from getting bigger, big enough that on almost any other landmass on Earth, they would have been someone else's prey. Here they were simply the largest things scurrying through the leaf litter. And Flores had one more resident. One that still exists today, on islands not far from here. The Komodo dragon, the largest lizard alive on Earth. Capable of killing prey many times its own size, with a single patient bite. Flo shared her cave system, her hunting grounds, her entire world. With an apex predator the size of a small crocodile. But the most dangerous animal on Flores may not have been the dragon at all. Fossil hunters also found the bones of an enormous stork. Over 1.5 meters tall, far too heavy to fly. Scientists named it Leptoptylos robustus. Picture a bird built like a small, muscular giraffe, with a beak like an axe blade. At Flo's height, that stork would have looked her almost directly in the eye. Some researchers believe it did more than just live alongside her. They believe it hunted her. So picture the world Flo actually woke up in every single morning. Dwarf elephants for food. Giant rats in the undergrowth. A dragon patient enough to wait days for a kill. And a bird tall enough to look her in the eye and strong enough to end her life in seconds. Here is the good news. Flores was rich with food if you knew how to get it. Here is the bad news. Almost everything on this island could kill you first. Every rule of scale that applies almost everywhere else on the planet simply did not apply here. This was not a gentle island paradise. This was one of the strangest, most hostile proving grounds evolution ever built. And somehow, a population of humans the size of children not only survived here, they thrived here for the better part of 1 million years, which raises the only question that actually matters. How did a population of humans, with a brain barely bigger than a grapefruit, survive on an island built to kill them? The answer starts with a pile of sharpened stone scattered across Liangbua and other sites nearby. Archaeologists found thousands of stone tools, small blades, sharpened points, flakes struck off with real, repeated skill. Some of these tools date back almost 1 million years. Far older than Flo herself. which means her ancestors were already using stone technology long before her own species even existed, and that technology never disappeared. It was passed down generation after generation for hundreds of thousands of years. Now look at what those tools were actually used for, around the same layers of cave floor. Archaeologists found the bones of young stegodon, the dwarf elephants, covered in cut marks, not the marks of a scavenger picking at a carcass long after the kill. The marks of a group working together, butchering an animal many times their own size. Coordinating a hunt like that takes more than blind instinct. It takes planning, timing, and some way of working together as a team. Take a moment and actually picture that hunt. A creature the size of a 3-year-old child, armed with nothing but sharpened stone, closing in on an animal built like a small tank. No claws, no size advantage, no weapon stronger than a fire-hardened point. And still, they won. Again and again for tens of thousands of years. There is also evidence, though still debated, of burned bone and blackened cave floor. Hints that Flo's people had learned to control fire. For decades, scientists assumed there was a hard rule to intelligence. A minimum brain size, below which complex behavior simply was not possible. Homo floresiensis broke that rule. Some researchers now believe her brain, though small, was unusually reorganized. Densely packed, efficient, shaped by evolution to do more with less. Think of it less like a smaller version of your brain, and more like a completely different piece of machinery, built for a completely different set of problems. It is a reminder worth sitting with for a second. Raw brain size was never the only ingredient of intelligence. It was always just one part of a much stranger recipe. So by every reasonable measure, Homo floresiensis should not have been possible, too small to overpower her prey, too small-brained to plan a hunt, too vulnerable to survive an island full of dragons and killer storks. And yet the evidence kept piling up, layer after layer, for almost 2 decades, which should have settled the debate. Instead, it set off one of the ugliest fights in modern paleoanthropology, because not every scientist was ready to believe what the bones were saying. Some of them were about to accuse the entire discovery of being a lie. Word of the discovery had barely finished spreading around the world before one of Indonesia's most senior paleoanthropologists publicly rejected it. His name was Tuku Jacob, and his verdict was blunt. There was no new species here at all. In his view, LB1 was simply a modern human, a Homo sapiens deformed by disease. The most popular version of his theory pointed to microcephaly, a real medical condition that shrinks the brain and skull of an otherwise normal person. If that were true, then Flo was never a new branch of the human family at all. She was simply someone's unlucky relative. A single sick individual misidentified by an overeager team of archaeologists. It was a serious accusation. And it was about to get personal. In December of 2004, just weeks after the discovery made headlines around the world, Jacob did something almost unheard of in science, without the full agreement of the original discovery team. He had the actual bones transported out of the research institution and brought to his own laboratory. For months, no one outside his lab knew exactly what was happening to one of the most important fossils ever found. When the bones finally came back, the original team was horrified. Cracks had appeared in one of the most fragile bones in the skeleton, the pelvis. A chin, once described in careful notes, appeared to have been damaged during casting. Some of the bones reportedly came back stained and in poorer condition than when they left. To this day, exactly what happened in that lab remains disputed, but one thing is not disputed. A piece of humanity's fossil record, hundreds of thousands of years old, came back changed. This is where our case turns into something closer to a criminal investigation than a scientific debate. Because over the following decade, one accusation was not enough. The skeptics kept building their case, suspect after suspect. Suspect number one: microcephaly. Researchers who supported this theory pointed to the small brain size and argued it matched certain microcephalic humans. But the rebuttal came fast. The skeleton's overall body proportions, wrist bones, and foot structure did not match any known case of human microcephaly ever recorded. Suspect number two: Laron syndrome, a rare form of dwarfism that leaves people short, but with body proportions closer to typical humans. Once again, the skeleton's primitive wrist and shoulder anatomy did not fit. Suspect number three: Down syndrome. A 2006 paper argued the skull shape resembled a modern human with this specific condition. Critics pointed out the paper relied on a single skull, ignored the dozen other individuals found at the same site, and overlooked bone features Down syndrome does not typically produce. Suspect number four: endemic cretinism caused by severe iodine deficiency. This one gained real traction for a while. It can produce small stature and altered skull shape in an otherwise modern human population. 4 suspects. 4 headline-making papers. 4 attempts to explain away an entire population as a case of individual illness. And every single time, the same problem kept surfacing. Every disease theory could maybe explain one skeleton. Not one of them could explain 12. For over a decade, the case remained open. Was Homo floresiensis a genuine ancient branch of the human family tree? Or was it the most famous case of a misdiagnosed skeleton in the history of anthropology? The jury was still out. And then, the island itself was about to hand down a verdict. In 2016, researchers digging at a site called Mata Menge, about 70 kilometers from Liang Bua, found something that ended the argument for good: a jawbone and a handful of teeth, smaller even than Flo's own, and dated to roughly 700,000 years old. That is nearly 5 times older than Flo herself, which means this small-bodied lineage was not a one-time accident. It had been living on this island, small and strange, for the better part of 1,000,000 years. No disease theory on Earth can explain a consistent medical condition appearing the same way in the same population for 700,000 years. One sick individual is a tragedy. An entire lineage stretching across 750,000 years is a species. Around the same time, more remains kept surfacing back at Liang Bua itself. Eventually, bones from at least a dozen individuals were recovered. Men and women spanning tens of thousands of years of continuous occupation. Detailed studies of the wrist bones published by specialists who had spent careers studying primate and human anatomy found a shape unlike any modern human on record. A close study of the foot bones told the exact same story. Every single line of independent evidence. The wrists, the feet, the shoulders, the teeth kept pointing at the same conclusion. This was not us wearing a costume of illness. This was something else entirely. By the mid-2010s, the scientific consensus had firmly shifted. Homo floresiensis was formally recognized as a genuine, distinct species of ancient human, the team that made the original discovery. The ones accused for over a decade of chasing a diseased skeleton had been right all along, and the implications reached far beyond one small island. For most of the 20th century, textbooks drew human evolution as a single line. One species evolving neatly into the next, in a straight march toward us. Homo floresiensis helped tear that chart apart, because while modern humans were already walking across other parts of the world, an entirely separate, tiny-bodied species of human was living out its own history on its own island, completely undisturbed. We were never the only ones here, not even close. And that raises one final, unsettling question. When exactly did this other kind of human disappear? And Flores was not even the only place this was happening. 3,000 kilometers north, on a completely different island, in a completely different country. The exact same story was about to repeat itself. Calao Cave on the island of Luzon in the Philippines. Archaeologists had been finding strange, small bones there since the early 2000s. A single toe bone here, a handful of teeth there. Curious, but not enough on their own to prove anything. Then, in 2019, more bones surfaced from the same cave floor, enough to formally describe an entirely new species, Homo luzonensis. Like Flo, it was small-bodied. Its teeth looked almost startlingly modern. But its finger and toe bones were curved, almost ape-like, built, it seems, for both walking upright on the ground and climbing with real strength through the trees, a strange, unclassifiable mix, just like her distant island cousin far to the south. And the dates. Homo luzonensis is estimated to have lived there somewhere between 50 and 67,000 years ago, almost the exact same window in which Homo floresiensis was living out its final chapter on Flores. Two separate islands. Two completely different, unrelated-seeming small human species, existing at almost the same moment in time, neither one aware the other existed, both, quite possibly, crossing paths with modern humans arriving in the exact same region. This is not a coincidence anyone fully understands yet. Some researchers now suspect that island Southeast Asia, with its scattered chains of isolated land, may have quietly produced small, unique human species again and again. Each one hidden on its own patch of jungle for tens or hundreds of thousands of years. How many more are still waiting, buried under some other cave floor we simply have not dug into yet? Nobody knows. But every single one we do find chips away a little more at the same tired old idea that evolution was ever building in a straight line toward one single inevitable outcome. It was not. It was branching, scattering, experimenting. On island after island, in cave after cave, all across the ancient world. And we are simply the branch that happened to still be standing when the story reached today. The very first dating estimates published back in 2004 suggested something almost impossible to believe, that Homo floresiensis might have still been alive as recently as 12,000 years ago. If that number had held up, it would have meant modern humans and this tiny separate species shared the same island for tens of thousands of years. For over a decade, that number stood largely unchallenged. Then, in 2016, the original team went back and re-examined their own dig, layer by layer, with new techniques. And they found a problem. Years of erosion inside the cave had shifted and eaten away parts of the original sediment, making the youngest layers look far younger than they actually were. Once corrected, the picture changed. The most reliable evidence now points to Homo floresiensis and the stone tools she made, disappearing around 50,000 years ago. It is a less dramatic number than 12,000. But it is still remarkably recent. Recent enough that modern humans were almost certainly already moving through this exact region of the world. So what actually happened to her? One leading theory points to the sky itself. Layers of volcanic ash, dated to roughly the same window, suggest a massive eruption tore through the region. An eruption capable of collapsing food chains across an entire ecosystem in a matter of months. Another theory points to us. The same pattern shows up again and again, on island after island, whenever modern humans finally arrive. Local populations of older, more ancient human relatives do not last long afterward, whether through direct conflict, competition for the exact same resources, or simply a disease we carried and they had no defense against. We cannot say for certain. What we can say is this. Shortly after modern humans reach this part of the world, Homo floresiensis vanishes from the fossil record entirely. But here is where the story takes one final, strange turn. On Flores today, the Naje people who live near Liang Bua tell a very old story. A story about creatures they call the Ebu Gogo, small, hairy, mumbling in a language no one else could understand, living deep in the forest, in caves, not unlike the one where Flo was found. According to the legend, the Ebu Gogo would raid village crops at night, and were eventually driven away by the very people whose gardens they stole from. Local storytellers do not place this in some distant mythical past. Some versions place it only a few hundred years ago. Scientists are careful here, and so should we be. A folk story is not physical evidence, and no confirmed Homo floresiensis fossil has ever been dated that recently. But it is hard not to notice the coincidence. Decades before any archaeologist ever picked up a trowel at Liang Bua, the people living right next to that cave were already describing something small, hairy, and human-shaped, hiding in their forests. Maybe it really is only a legend, born from something else entirely. Or maybe folk memory holds on to things far longer than we give it credit for. Either way, one question is left hanging in the air over that island, unanswered to this day. What if the last of them held on? Just a little longer than the fossils have been able to prove. It is tempting to think of ourselves as the finish line of evolution. The one species everything else was building toward. Homo floresiensis is proof that this was never true. For most of the last few million years, more than one kind of human walked the earth at the very same time. Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans across Asia, and on one small, forgotten island, a population barely over a meter tall, quietly surviving for the better part of 1 million years. We are not the rule, we are the exception. The only time in all of human history that exactly one human species has stood alone on the entire planet is right now. Today, Liang Bua Cave is quiet again. The excavation pits have been carefully filled back in, or left open for the next generation of researchers to study. Tourists occasionally walk through, following a guide, barely aware of what once emerged from that dark floor, but somewhere in the layers beneath their feet. The story is still being written. New dating techniques, new bones, new sites nearby are still being uncovered every few years. Every one of them adding another sentence to a story we are still nowhere close to finishing. So let's go back to where we started, September of 2003. A team of archaeologists digging for evidence of something else entirely, and a trowel scraping against a curve of bone that should not have been there. They thought at first that they had found a child. They had actually found an entire branch of the human family. One the world had never even imagined existed, small enough to stand in the palm of the story of human evolution, and large enough to rewrite it. Homo floresiensis, the Hobbit of Flores, a reminder that the map of what it means to be human is far stranger and far more crowded than we ever gave it credit for.